So yes, my name is Brandon Steffen. I'm the operations technical lead here at Corva. Earlier, I gave a discussion on pulling data from Corva's API. And now I'm going to show you guys how to pull from Corva and integrate it into Spotfire, which is a popular BI tool a lot of our customers are using. So on my agenda today, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about framing this problem that we hear from with a lot of either customers or just operators in general. We're going to talk about methods to integrate Corva data with Spotfire. We're going to talk about super high-level 1,000-foot overview of Corva's REST API, and then I'm going to give you guys a walkthrough of a dashboard that I created, so that way you guys know how to go through this process yourself. So when we talk about framing the problem, something I've seen come up time and time again is that many various operators, they're trying to pursue their internal analytics solutions themselves and kind of go at it rogue about it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they're going to face lots of obstacles. It's going to be data quality concerns. You're going to have security concerns, infrastructure concerns. And at the end of the day, you start to ask, is this cost worth my reward? So then they seek, to use these business intelligence tools, which at least provide some advantages and help to streamline some of their internal analytics process, as opposed to building these things from scratch in React or something like that. They offer a lot of advantages. So typically there's a lot of customization available for their visualizations. You can provide data wrangling within the dashboard tool itself. Some of them have predictive analytics, and then all in all, they're pretty powerful tools, but it still doesn't necessarily always fix the chicken and egg scenario of getting the data to the dashboard. So the solution is to use Corva's data to basically power your dashboard. What we provide is real-time data center analysis, post-well analysis, and just generic, data entry and data quality automation. We're abstracting all of the complicated infrastructure that you would need to build your dashboarding solutions if you were to do it from scratch. We're giving you real-time ingestion, the storage required to house all of this big data. We have a flexible schema, so we can house all sorts of different WITs, channels transmitted over, and we have access and security in mind. So when we're talking about actually integrating, how do you get the data from, say, Corva into your own in-house analytics solutions like Spotfire? There are a couple of different methods that we could tackle or approach to address this. One of the first and probably kind of most obvious methods is, hey, let's just start warehousing the data ourselves. And we have plenty of customers who do that, but we just have to remember that the process does have its own complications. We're going to have to track maybe the last runtime or the last freshness of the data that we've taken from Corva, and we're going to have to iteratively pull from Corva's API. It's going to require external data storage, and you run into an issue that we call data synchronization. So that's if, let's say if we have a signal down from either the rig or from a Streambox, due to internet issues, things like that, you can actually become off sync. Additionally, if we are doing some sort of processing or things like that, there can be this disconnect. However, it is suitable for some use cases, and that doesn't mean it's necessarily a wrong approach. So some of the other methods that we can integrate Corva with our BI tools would be just doing a simple basic CSV export like I'm showing here in the picture. So pretty much every visualization in Corva allows you to export as CSV, at which point you could upload that to a table and have your dashboarding tool wrangle that. Obviously, that's somewhat of a manual process. So there's an even better method that I propose, which is really an API pull on command. So what I'm going to show you how to do is basically invoke the Corva API when you load your Spotfire dashboard, so that way you're pulling the freshest data available and you're kind of abstracting away all of the complexities involved with building that infrastructure and the data synchronization problem and things like that. So to do that, just a really high-level refresher. So if we want to pull data from Corva, we're going to use the REST API. The REST API itself is language agnostic, so we can use it in Python or any other tools. And we just need to make sure that we have a web connection, authentication, and then the issue to issue an HTTPS request. So when it comes to getting started, I know I mentioned it in my previous discussion, but you guys can always, refer to the Swagger documentation. Google Chrome developer tools is something that a lot of us do internally to find where things are coming from in Corva. And then you can also refer to the Corva Dev Center documentation or talk to myself, send me a personal email and I'll help you out. So now we're going to go through kind of a demonstration of how I was able to pull data into the Spotfire dashboard using Corva's API directly. Couple notes is that it is going to require that you have Spotfire Desktop or Analyst, one of those more powerful versions of Spotfire installed. If you have like a consumer license, for example, you won't be able to do this. But that being said, the dashboard's 100% reproducible and shareable. If you guys want it, I can give it to you. And as long as you have your API key, you should be able to authenticate with it. And again, it's secure because it requires that your API key is stored to your environment. So if you're sharing it with people, it won't give that hard-coded API key away. So with that being said, let me show you what I have so far. So you guys should see here, this is a very simple kind of proof of concept dashboard. Obviously, like you could do all sorts of things with this. Anyone who's worked with some of these BI tools before, like really whatever you can come up with, you could do from Corva. And then if I go to my map here, we can see that this other data is slightly on the dashboard. So what's happening is I'm pulling in cost information from one collection in Corva. I'm pulling in days versus depth from another collection in Corva, and then I'm pulling in some sample BHA data from Corva. So this is all loaded on demand and on the fly. So if I were to go into Corva right now and modify some things and you reload the dashboard, it's automatically synced up with. So to get started, what we're going to do here is we want to make sure first that we have all of our Python interpreters set up in Spotfire. So if I go here to tools and we go to Python tools, what you should see is that you have this path to local Python. This is how I'm going to read the Python. This is what I'm going to pass my Python code into to interpret it and render all of this data. And then we go to our package management tab here. For this script, we're going to install them into our environment here within this package management tool. It takes a couple of seconds to come up, but you can see that I have a couple different libraries installed here, like requests, pandas, OS, some libraries, SDK and things like that are available within Spotfire. So that's pretty cool. So once we've set up our environment, really the next step is we put in our scripts to create the tables. So if we go to data and then we go to data function properties, you're going to see that I have a couple of data functions here. So the first one is this assets table function. So what this is doing is it's pulling the assets from Corva and putting them on the map. So if I go here into edit script, I have just a high level description. I'm doing this in Python, but you could technically do it in R. Okay. And then I have all of my script down here. And you'll notice this part right here is actually carbon copied from that API demonstration I gave earlier. So if you're already familiar with the API, it's not really much of a change to get up and running with using Corva within Spotfire. So we can see here that I issued some API calls. And then you might be wondering, how am I actually passing that information to Spotfire, right? It took me a minute to figure that out too, but it's actually pretty do is I'm going to create an parameter. Okay, and in this case, I have an output parameter. I'm going to show you where that goes in a minute. But I called it assets table, and I set that equal to calling to generate the table. So all I'm doing here, I want to make sure that this tabular data set is equal to my output parameter. And then in this case, I'm just grabbing a subset of columns and renaming them just to pretty them parameter specified. In this case, I have that assets table stored as a variable. If I go to edit, we can see that it's of type table. And I have a logical display name and parameter name. But we could obviously always come here and we could add other parameters too if we wanted to have multiple outputs from one function. Okay. So what happens now is when it runs, it's going to save that information to the assets table output parameter. And then I'm going to go here to edit parameters. And then I'm going to set the output and input handlers for Spotfire. In this case, I don't have any input handlers, but I'll show you an example in just a minute where I do. And then I have my output handler here. So I'm basically mapping the assets table output variable to a table within Spotfire. So what I've done here is I'm taking this assets table of type table, I'm telling the output handler to render that as a data table, and then just to replace the existing data table. If you're doing this for the first time, it might say create new data table and just fill that in. And then from that point on, it will just automatically update that table. Okay. Map here that when I select things, these plots are updating as well. Now, there are some other performance enhancements that I could make to this dashboard where maybe I'm doing asynchronous calls and things like that. I try to keep it really straightforward for this. But one kind of optimization that I did add and that I think is a good practice to get your dashboard loaded quickly is to use the data limiting abilities within Spotfire. So what happens is you can mark records and then grab those records that you've marked and extract those asset IDs from that marked records and pass that into the API to issue out future API calls. So you're not loading all that you need. So like, for example, in this BHA table, you'll notice here what I've done is very similar to before, where I have my script here and I'm just issuing API calls, but look at my input parameters. So in this case, I do have an input parameter. If I go to edit it, you'll see it's called marked assets and it's of column because basically I have a table that I'm marking from and I'm going to grab that column. And I'm just setting the data type to string, but it could be whatever you need it to be. Okay. And then again, I have a parameter very similar to before when we have a table as our output. So if we look at the script itself, very similar to some of the other things that I've shown you in terms of these API calls. Not too much is changing there, but basically all I've added extra to it is I'm accessing the marked assets input variable to grab those values and just iteratively looping and fetching that information from Corva. Again, you could totally optimize this and do sync call and all of that, but that's kind of outside of the scope of this session. The columns that I want to it. And then that's really it. There is one caveat that I've noticed. It's that with this approach, if you have an entirely empty data set, Spotfire is not going to know how to render those columns. So it says, hey, here's data, but I don't know what type this asset ID is because there's nothing here to go off of, right? So what I've done in this case is if nothing is marked, I've actually just kind of made like a dummy record where there's at least always one value within the table. And I just filter that out of my visualizations. And I can show you how I do that. Okay. And then I'm on the DVD table, but it's the same exact thing as for the BA. Doing the same process, fetching from Corva's API, using assets, and then storing to an output, just like before. Okay. And then what I'm doing here is whenever nothing is marked, I have a dash in here where I'm saying that the asset ID has to be greater than 0 because I just set the dummy value where asset ID is 0. But that's just kind of like a little workaround. That's kind of a Spotfire specific thing. So you might be asking, how am I capturing the marked assets? So let me show you how I did that really quickly. So if I go here to my parameters, remember how before I was showing you you're entering the script, you're creating the variables, and then you handle the input and output to map that somewhere in Spotfire. So what I'm doing here in this output tab is I'm accessing marked assets of type column. I'm saying the input handler needs to treat it like a column. Okay, and I'm selecting that I want the column asset ID from the assets table. So when that's in this example, but you could in theory have different filters and things like that you want to make sure you take into consideration. But the big thing here is if you look at marked rows, you can see where I have marking 0 rows. In this case, anything marked. But I'm going to access that information, and then I'm going to pass on as my marked assets for all of the subsequent steps. A couple things that we could consider doing. Like I said, we can make asynchronous calls to make it faster. You could actually do more like table caching and things like that. Those are all outside of the scope of this presentation. But really, the main thing, I just wanted to show you guys how to accomplish this. And you can see it's actually pretty simple and not too much different than just issuing API calls within Corva. Yet it actually gives a lot of benefits because it abstracts away some of the complexities of like having to warehouse that data and handle these data from Corva to populate a dashboard when really you could probably load it on the fly and be totally fine.